Greetings in the name of our Lord Jesus Christ. Welcome to the Catherine Rockies podcast. We are so glad to have you with us today. This is our interview segment titled, What Has Life Taught You? A space where we dive into stories, wisdom, and life lessons that have shaped our guest's journey. Our guest today is truly a remarkable individual. Someone whose life has been a testimony of service, dedication, and leadership on a global scale. He is a renowned speaker, best-selling author, a former U.S. diplomat, and the executive director of the Giraffe Heroes Project, just to name a few of his impressive roles. His life's work continues to inspire and challenge many around the world. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to our guest, Mr. John Graham.
Thank you. Thank you.
Mr. Graham, it's such an honor to have you with us today. We are eager to hear from you and learn about the life lessons that have shaped who you are. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much. I'm very happy to be here, Catherine. Very happy.
Okay, let's jump right in. Mr. Graham, you've had such a diverse and impactful journey from serving as a diplomat to leading the Giraffe Heroes Project to speaking all over the world. We are curious, when you reflect on your life, what are some of the key lessons that stand out to you the most? What has life taught you?
Well, I must say, first of all, Catherine, that I'm a very slow learner, and life has taught me a lot, but I had an awful lot to learn. You mentioned all these wonderful things that I have done and do, and I'm very appreciative that you mentioned them, but you didn't say that almost the first half of my life was not exactly God-led. I was an adventurer. The only thing that mattered to me was the next adrenaline rush. I sought one risky thing after the other. I really didn't care about other people at all. I've done a lot of really risky mountain climbing, for example, in the Foreign Service. Well, yes, I ended up doing some really good things, but in the beginning, I worked on wars and revolutions, depending on which way the United States was going. And I loved it. And the more that the bullets whistled past my ear and didn't hit me, and the more that I didn't die in a mountain climbing fall, the more determined I was to believe that the only thing that mattered in my life, the only real meaning in my life, certainly wasn't God, was my own self. And was my own ego, was my own satisfaction of my own ego needs for adventure. And during a battle in Vietnam, it was the lowest point of my life, and it suddenly hit me how shallow my life had become. And this is where the lesson that you spoke of begins. I was there in Vietnam in a war I knew was wrong. I didn't believe in it. I knew we were losing. I knew why we were losing. And yet I kept at it because that's what I was being paid to do, but also because I loved the adventure of it. Now, all of a sudden, I was in the middle of a shooting war. People were dying, some of them because of what I was doing. And I hated being there. I knew it was all wrong. So I survived Vietnam and I came back and in California I began to basically reconstruct my life. I went to a lot of what were then called encounter groups. They were basically group sessions where you would sit around with other people who were trying to figure out their lives, and you would try to talk honestly about it. And I gained a lot from that because I began to learn that beneath all this John Wayne bravado, beneath all this selfish following of my own ego needs for adventure, beneath all of that, Catherine, was a heart. was a real need to give back, was a real need to use my skills and resources not to start wars, but to stop them, but to fight for peace and justice issues in the world, which I had plenty of qualities to do that. I was smart and I was tough, and now I was experienced. And it took me a long time to crawl out of a self-centered hole. But I guess I'm going to stop talking now because I know you have other related questions. But the first part of my answer to your question, the life lessons, is that first of all, I had to hit bottom, and I did.
Wow. So, can you think of a specific setback or challenge where you lean on one of these lessons to guide you through? How did it help you navigate the situation differently than you might have before?
Yes. Well, after Vietnam, I came back. I was still in the U.S. Foreign Service, and I was finally posted to the United Nations. I was still the same person I was when I went to Vietnam, but my life had changed. My life orientation had changed, and I looked at situations and challenges in front of me with a whole different light. I looked at them not as a chance for adventures, but as a chance to do good in the world. I mean, there were enormous problems that I had to deal with. Most of my work at the United Nations was dealing with the so-called third world, the global south, the poor nations, which there were tremendous, and still are, tremendous needs of peace and justice. And all the things that I had seen before, poverty, disease, war, violence, took on a different light in answer to your question. I saw them now as problems to be solved, not as avenues for adventure. And I set out trying to solve them, and darned if I didn't succeed in some instances. At the United Nations, I'm quite proud of some of the work I did in the decolonization struggle, for example, among former colonies in Africa and Asia, and in some of the bitter fights over peace and justice issues, where the rich countries didn't really want to spend a lot of time giving attention and money to the poor nations, and I fought for the poorer nations at the United Nations. And one of the things I did that I'm very proud of was that my efforts helped end apartheid, the system of institutionalized racism in South Africa. I helped end it, and I took enormous risks to do that. But they weren't the risk of bullets whistling by my ear, but the risk of being fired or even jailed sometimes because I would go way past where my government wanted me to do, and I would do things on my own at the United Nations that really did help make the world a better place, and I'm very proud for that. But it was in seeing the world's problems in a different light. And I guess that's the answer to your question. Same problems. It's just that now I was on the other side of them.
Wow. So, looking back on that moment, what would you say was the biggest takeaway or realization that came from it? How did it change your perspective or actions moving forward?
Yes, very good questions. What changed my perspective? And it was this. I finally figured out, and I think this is true not just for me, but for all of us, that the most important thing in any person's life is to find the meaning of that life. Why am I here? I look at the mirror in the morning and what looks back at me. I want to know that I make a difference, that I'm not just on the planet taking up space. There has to be a meaning. To live a life without meaning to me would be like being a fine Swiss watch with no hands, and it wouldn't make any sense at all. So that was the first thing. There's got to be a meaning for my life. Well, then what is that meaning? Well, in the beginning, as a young man, I thought the meaning was adventure, and that was too shallow. Other people think that they can find the meaning in their lives today from money or power. And that doesn't work either, not for the long term. And what I discovered, and here's the answer to your question, what I discovered is that the true stable source of meaning in anyone's life is to be of service, is to find what you can do with your skills and resources. That's why you're here. That's why you're on the planet. You need to find out what you need to do, find out some problem and whose solution resonates with you, and then set out to solve it. It doesn't mean you have to be a saint, Catherine. Most of us are not saints. It doesn't mean that you have to work in a nonprofit and be poor the rest of your life. No, no, no. You can be a wonderful servant. You can be a wonderful servant and be in the business world, for example, making a fine product, selling it at a fair price, and mindful of environmental restrictions and community involvement. You can be a servant as an artist. You can be a servant in the professions as a surgeon or as a singer or whatever. You can be a servant anywhere. You just look around and see what you can do. What are the problems? What are the problems in your area of expertise where you have the skills to make a difference and you need to figure out how to make a difference? It may be a very small difference. No one's asking you to solve global warming by yourself. It may be a small difference right in your own family. For example, a troubled teenager, or perhaps a relative with a substance abuse problem, or perhaps it's in your community struggling to deal with a pollution issue or a homelessness issue that you have the skills and resources to help with. Or it could be a global issue. Maybe you have some contacts that can make a difference in Gaza or the Ukraine. Or maybe it's something you can do to help heal the terrible wounds that are tearing the United States apart as we learn to hate each other more and more instead of love each other. There's all kinds of things you can do, from the very smallest things that perhaps few people will notice to larger things if you have the skills and resources to do that.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So, as someone who has had such a rich and varied career, what is it that still excites you about the future? Are there any new areas you would like to explore or new challenges you would like to take on?
Oh, yes, yes. I'm 82 years old, Catherine, and I feel much younger than that because there are so many new challenges. And now, at 82, if I may say so immodestly, I've gained a fair amount of wisdom and expertise and skill, and I can apply that. I move a little slower, perhaps, but my brain works just fine. And specifically to answer your question, I realize that I've got to do a better job of reaching out to younger people. Most of my messaging for my speeches and my books and stuff is oriented toward older populations, people who've gone through things like I have gone through. And I realized that I wasn't reaching specifically to a younger generation that takes in their information from their phones and has an initial attention span measured sometimes in seconds instead of minutes. So
Mm-hmm.
you all know what I'm talking about. And so I've
Mm-hmm.
started now, and I urge your listeners to tune in on it on TikTok and on Instagram. I've started a whole new series of very short 3-minute videos, all under the title Badass Granddad. Sorry for the ass, but anyway, that's what I called it to get the attention of younger people. So, Badass Granddad. And you can dial it up on TikTok or Instagram. I've done about 15 of them so far. I aim to do about 100 of them. And they're all stories of adventures, but they don't end just with the adventures. They end with some life lessons based on that adventure, and then some kind of a call to action regarding key elements like service and leadership and compassion. And I'm getting a very good viewership. I think they say I've reached about 70,000 people already in just what 2 months, 2 or 3 months. So that's what's exciting me now because now I've got all these young people saying, "Hey, Granddad, thanks for that story. You really made me think, Granddad. I never had a granddad, and it's like, oh, yeah, it's making me feel a little younger again. So I'm looking for opportunities wherever I can find them. And by the way, your podcast is one such opportunity. I'm now finding that I am, shall I say, reasonably popular as a guest on other people's podcasts. I don't have to
Mm-hmm.
start my own because there are
Yeah.
some really fine, experienced people like yourself who know how to do this, and I can contribute by simply appearing on their programs. And so I appreciate you, and I thank you and the others so much for providing this kind of a platform, a theater for me to express some of my views.
Thank you so much, Mr. Graham. I really appreciate you coming on today. So, how do you think the lessons you've learned has influenced the way you interact with others?
Oh, that's easy. The lessons I learned have completely reoriented how I act with other people. I don't see other people as necessarily as competitors or obstacles. I see them as fellow laborers in the vineyard, as it says in the good book. I see problems as things, opportunities for me to be of service instead of to have an adventure. And the ironic thing is that the more I get involved in all of the service work, the bigger an adventure it is. So I have my cake and I eat it as well. So yeah, no, everything has changed. I see the world quite differently. I see the world as a huge bundle of opportunities. And I'm 82, so I've got a few years left to help solve them. And in those few years, I'm also training other people, hopefully reaching other people with a message like on this podcast, or in the TikTok series, Grad Ass Bandit, or in my books. Um, my memoir, if I can put in a plug, is called Quest, Quest. A subtitle is Risk, Adventure, and the Search for Meaning. And so I'm reaching others. So when I'm gone, there's still something of me left with this messaging.
Wow. So, in your leadership and interaction with people, whether in your personal or professional life, how do you make sure those lessons are passed on or communicated to others? Are there specific ways you try to mentor or empower those around you?
Specific ways. Yes, you have to be a little clever. Well, you're in the media business, Catherine. You know perfectly well what I'm talking about. You have to be a little clever. When I talk, trying to reach an audience on TikTok of people who are 22 years old, well, I use different languages. I start with rollicking adventure stories. I use looser language. I mean, I do everything I can to get their attention, and that's important. You have to give of yourself to the extent where whatever you've learned about how to present a message might have to change. And for example, when I give a speech, I do some preaching in churches, for example, and that's one kind of speech. But often my audiences are not that. They are preaching to business audiences, which I regard as the toughest audience for me because business people are so skeptical and they're so attuned to making money and amassing power. So they tend to look upon someone like me as like irrelevant. So when I speak to a business audience, let's say I'm given 45 minutes to speak to a large gathering of maybe a couple thousand business people at their annual gathering. Well, in that 45 minutes, I'll spend 35 of them telling my adventure stories so that everybody in that room understands that I'm no fool. I'm no one, I'm someone to be reckoned with. I've had a life of more consequence than anyone else in that room, and they understand that. So they drop their phones and they drop their pencils and pens and they lean forward waiting for the next story, and I have their attention. And then in that last 10 minutes, when I have their attention, then I pivot my talk and orient it toward, well, why did John Graham change? John Graham changed because of these impetuses on John Graham's life, and they are the same impetuses in your life too. He looked around just as you can look around. He seeks meaning in his life the same way you seek meaning in your life. Well, let me help you. Let me help you do that. This is how I found the meaning. This is how I'm of service. This is how you can be of service without giving up your day job. Go ahead and make millions of dollars. I don't care. That's fine. But do it in a way that's of service to the planet. And so I pivot so that my messaging now is right in the wheelhouse, right in the attention span, right in the area of interest of these powerful business people. And I do the same thing if I'm talking to a college graduation class at their graduation, or whatever, a national association of this or that, oriented toward what these people are doing. But I have to be conscious of that. I have to care enough about my audiences to put myself in their laps, as my wife Anne would put it, put myself in their laps so that they understand that at least I'm trying to be one of them and they listen a bit better.
That is absolutely a great strategy. So, if you could go back and give your younger self a piece of advice based on what life has taught you, what would it be?
Piece of advice to a young man, I suppose it would be looking for a broader, deeper life. I was so attracted by physical adventure as a young man, I didn't see anything else. I saw lots of problems, but I didn't think it was my job to solve them. The only thing I cared about was having the next risk-taking adventure. Um, so I would have hoped that I could have done more reflection, more attempts to really probe who I was, because even as a young man, I know I had a heart, but it was kind of like I had nailed a large piece of wood over my heart, so that I couldn't feel it anymore. All I cared about was stuff that was physical, that was dangerous. And I would have liked to have lived a younger life without that board over my heart so that I could have listened more to people in pain, listened more to people whose suffering I should have cared about and did not.
Wow, thank you, Mr. Graham. So, before we wrap up, do you have any final words of encouragement or wisdom that you would like to share with our listeners today?
Yes, well, I think, Catherine, I hope I've been doing some of that as we have been talking. But my final piece of wisdom would be to look at the basic need of all of us in the Christian and the non-Christian world is to find the meaning of our life. And that could very well be through our relationship with God, but I'm also speaking to godless people. You find the meaning of your life because it applies to you as well. And when you find the meaning of your life, I suspect that strongly you'll find the most permanent form of that meaning in some kind of service. So that means you have to look at yourself. You have to gauge your qualities, whatever they are, your skills, your resources, your passions. What do you care about? And then orient your life toward doing something that uses the best of you to solve the problems you really care about. And also the last thing I would say to the people that you asked me to advise is that this does not mean sacrifice. It does not mean, what do they call it? Sackcloth and ashes. No, no, it doesn't mean that at all. For example, do I look like I'm unhappy? I'm not. I'm having a wonderful time of my life, and yet my whole life has been devoted to service for a long time through the organization that my wife and I run, which is called the Giraffe Heroes Project. By the way, yes, I should leave your listeners with this, the giraffe.org, very important. That's the URL, the website of the Giraffe Heroes Project. And what we do is we find people who have made this discovery of service in their life. They've looked around, they've seen the problem, and goddamn it, excuse me, I shouldn't have said that. They looked around and they said, darn it, I can find that. I can make a difference. And they go out and do it, and they take risks to do it. They stick their necks out, which is why the project is called the Giraffe Heroes Project. We're looking for people who are sticking their necks out, and anyone can do that. I think some of the youngest giraffe heroes we found are maybe only 10 years old, and I think the
Wow.
oldest is almost a century old. So, you know, look around. Don't hesitate, and be bold. Be bold. Yes, yes. Be perfectly willing to take risks. Maybe not the risk of hanging from a rope on a steep mountain, but taking the risk of maybe offending other people if you have to. Take the risk of conflict by wading into a difficult situation and doing your best to bring peace to it. There are all kinds of risks out there. Maybe it's the risk of losing a lot of money, whatever. There are risks out there. But if you live a life without risk, I may say to your listeners, it's a life that is ultimately inconsequential. I'm sorry to be so blunt, but you can't live a life without risk because risk is so important to success. It's the kind of risks you take that are important, and that's what I've discovered.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Mr. Graham. So, before we end today's episode, do you have any exciting projects coming up or anything you would like our listeners to keep an eye out for?
Yes, Catherine, thank you. I've already mentioned my new effort to reach out to younger people through the badass granddad meme on TikTok, on Instagram, and that's where I'm focusing a lot of my attention on now. I've got a new book coming out on some mountain adventures called Denali Diary. But the key thing I think is, and for many of the things I've talked about, is that memoir, quest, risk, adventure, and the search for meaning. You can find it get it ordered from any bookstore or find it on Amazon. Um, and my own website is johngraham.org. So you can go to any of these places and follow up on what I'm doing. And hopefully communicate with me, ask questions, whatever, because I know that life is complicated. Believe me, I know it's complicated. And I've made so many mistakes. It's hard to think of anyone who's made more mistakes than I have. And yet I've come out the other side as a relatively decent human being. And so it's possible.
Thank you so much, Mr. Graham. So, for anyone who would like to connect with you or learn more about your work, what is the best way for our listeners to reach out or follow you?
Yes, I would suggest. Well, first of all, I have a URL. I have a web address, which is Graham at giraffe, GIRAFFE.org. Graham at giraffe.org. That's how to communicate with me directly. My own website, as I said, is johngraham.org. The organization, the Giraffe Heroes Project, which I strongly urge your listeners to tap into, is giraffe.org. In there, for example, you'll find a library of over 1,500 giraffe heroes, each of whose story is more exciting and impactful than the one before. These are wonderful stories we've amassed from people all over the world for 40 years. And so it's a marvelous inspirational resource of what human beings can do when they orient their lives toward making a difference. So those are places to start learning more about the work of the Giraffe Heroes Project and my own work.
Again, Mr. Graham, thank you for joining us today for this amazing conversation. Your insights have been invaluable, and we know our listeners will be inspired by your journey. To our listeners, thank you so much for tuning in. It's always a joy to have you with us. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and comment. We'll see you in the next episode. Thank you, and God bless.